Okay, so how did Mali control the gold trade and build an empire out of it? It starts with a picture. There's a map drawn in 1375, in Spain, called the Catalan Atlas, and in the middle of that map sits a king, holding a gold nugget so large it's practically the size of his head. The label underneath calls him the richest and most noble king in all the land. That king is Mansa Musa, ruler of the Mali Empire, and for most people, he is the whole story. Modern headlines call him the richest person in history, and the story that goes with the picture is the story everyone knows. So much gold that when he passed through Cairo on his way to Mecca, he handed out so much of it that he crashed the gold market, and prices stayed depressed for about a decade. That is the famous version. Here is the detail the famous version leaves out. That nugget in the picture was the one form of gold he was forbidden to trade. Under his own law, gold nuggets belonged to the king alone, and nobody in the empire was allowed to buy or sell them. The king held them, and he did not spend them. So the symbol of his wealth was the one thing he could never turn into money. Which raises an odd question. If the man the headlines call the richest person in history couldn't spend the gold in the famous picture, what was he actually rich in? Because he was rich in something. You don't crash a market in Cairo by accident. The answer isn't where you'd expect. It's not in the king's hand, and it's not in the ground. By the end of this, you'll understand what the empire was really selling, and why the richest-looking asset of the medieval world couldn't save it. To get there, we have to start with the event that made the king famous, because the Hajj is where everything starts to turn strange. Mansa Musa ruled Mali from roughly 1312 to 1337. In 1324, he did what a devout ruler of his time was expected to do. He set out for Mecca, but he did not travel light. He crossed the Sahara with an entourage, so large that it registered in the historical record of another continent. Thousands of people, pack animals, servants, and gold. The desert crossing alone is worth pausing on, because nobody in the story treats it like a stroll. The Sahara in the 1400s was a wall of sand, and a caravan crossing it was a bet with the desert. Weeks without water, sandstorms that could bury a camp, raiders who knew exactly where the waterholes were. Not everyone who started the crossing finished it. That was the price of doing business on this road, and it was paid in human lives, every single year, on both sides of the trade. So when Musa's caravan reached Cairo, the greatest city in the Islamic world, he arrived with something the city had never seen in one place: gold. He gave it away to anyone who asked. He spent freely in the markets, and according to the chroniclers who watched it happen, he broke the market. Gold was suddenly everywhere, which meant gold was suddenly worth less. Prices in Cairo stayed depressed for the better part of a decade. And here is the detail that makes the story human instead of myth. On the way home, the man the headlines call the richest in history had to borrow money at high interest in Cairo. He had spent so much gold that he had to ask the very merchants he had just impoverished to lend him enough to get home. Read that again. The richest man in the medieval world was short of cash. Now, if you know the simplified version of this story, the next question writes itself. If one ruler could carry that much gold, the empire must have owned the mines, right? The king sits on the goldfields. The workers dig. The gold flows into his treasury. That is not what happened, and this is the first thing the famous picture hides from you. The Mali Empire did not dig the gold. It did not run the diggings. The goldfields in regions called Bambuk, Bureau, and Galam were worked by independent producers, separate people with their own communities, their own methods, and their own reasons for digging. And here's the part that should make you stop and reconsider the whole story. If Mali didn't control the diggings, then what exactly did it control? Because it controlled something. It had to. The richest empire of its age doesn't get built on nothing. The answer isn't in the ground, it's in the space around the gold. And to see that space, you have to go to the edge of the desert, where the caravans come in. To see the space around the gold, you need to stand where the gold actually was, and where it had to go. The goldfields sat on the southern edge of a world that ended at a wall of sand. North of them, the Sahara, the largest hot desert on Earth. On the other side of that desert, the Mediterranean, full of cities starving for gold, for coinage, for trade. Between the goldfields and the Mediterranean lay more than 1,000 miles of open desert, and the only way across it was a chain of oasis towns and caravan routes worn into the sand over centuries. That is the corridor, and the corridor ran straight through the territory that became Mali. So picture a caravan coming out of the desert, hundreds of camels, loaded down, bells on, moving in a line that stretches for a mile. The drivers have been weeks without seeing a green thing. They are carrying salt, cut into slabs, mined in the desert itself, from places like Tagaza, where men lived and worked in a landscape with almost nothing else in it. They are bringing that salt south, because in the hot humid country beyond the desert, salt was scarce. It was life. The human body needs salt to survive, and the people of the South would trade almost anything for it. And what did they have to trade? Gold. According to the accounts of the travelers, a load of salt could be worth several times more in the South than it was worth in the North. The desert's most common mineral traded ounce for ounce against the world's most valuable metal, and every ounce of it moved through the land Mali controlled. So how does a kingdom that sits between a desert and a river bend turn that position into the richest empire of its age? It did not do it one way. It did it three ways at once, and all three skimmed the same flowing river of gold. The first stream is the simplest. Taxes. Everything that crossed Mali's borders was taxed. Gold moving north, salt moving south, copper, textiles, cola nuts, and people, because the trans-Saharan trade moved enslaved people too, north across the desert, in the same caravans that carried salt and gold. It's an ugly part of the story, and it belongs in the story. The route that made Mali rich was also a route that carried human beings as cargo. The caravans paid to enter the territory. They paid to pass through it. They paid to sell in its markets. The empire sat at the choke point and charged every single ounce a fee for the privilege of moving. It's not complicated, it's just relentless. The second stream is state trading. The empire didn't just tax the trade, it got into the trade. The Mansa's agents bought goods when they were cheap and sold them when they were dear, at the scale of a whole kingdom, with the power to set terms no single merchant could refuse. Buy low, sell high, across an entire empire, every season. And the third stream is the strangest, and it's the one that explains the nugget in the painting. The Mansa held the exclusive right to gold nuggets. The big pieces belonged to him alone. Meanwhile, ordinary trade inside Mali didn't run on coins, and it didn't run on nuggets. It ran on gold dust, weighed, sealed into leather bags, each bag following a fixed standard. The unit was called a mithqal, roughly 4.5 grams. And this is where the nugget rule stops looking like a king being greedy and starts looking like a king being careful. Think about what happens if everyone can sell nuggets freely. Big pieces hit the market, the supply of gold surges, and the value of gold collapses. Every trader in the empire suddenly finds that the gold dust in his bag is worth less than it was last season, and the whole economy runs on that dust. So the empire pulled the big pieces out of circulation, locked them in the king's treasury, and standardized everything else into measured dust. It was inflation control, in the 14th century, in the middle of West Africa. That pile of gold in the king's treasury wasn't the kingdom's wealth. It was the kingdom's anchor. And if you want proof of what happens when that discipline breaks, you don't have to imagine it, you just have to remember Cairo. The moment the pile hit the open market, it stopped being wealth and became a weapon aimed at the value of every other ounce of gold in the world. The market took a decade to recover. The pile was the trap, the flow was the treasure, and Mali understood that distinction better than almost anyone else in the medieval world. Now we come to the part of the machine that most people never hear about, and it's the part that makes the whole system fragile. The gold was dug by independent producers, and the empire could not command them. It could tax them, it could buy from them, it could protect the trade routes that made their gold worth anything at all, but it could not make the gold come out of the ground. The accounts tell us the producers kept their own beliefs and refused to convert to Islam, and the rulers of Mali deliberately left them alone. They did not push, they did not force, because the production of gold was tied to the rituals. If you disrupted the rituals, you might disrupt the gold. So the richest empire in the medieval world depended, every single day, on the goodwill of people it did not rule. And the travelers who visited the region wrote that the trade happened through something called the silent trade. Merchants would lay their goods out on the ground and withdraw. The producers would come, leave a quantity of gold, and withdraw. If the merchant was satisfied, he took the gold and left more goods. Nobody met, nobody spoke, nobody learned exactly where the gold came from. Whether it happened exactly as the travelers described, we can't verify. It comes to us as legend, but the meaning of the legend is real. The empire guarded the source of its wealth the way you guard a secret. Because if nobody knows where the gold comes from, nobody can go get it for themselves. The mystery wasn't decoration, it was a monopoly. And a monopoly built on a secret, not on walls, has a weak spot, and the weak spot is the secret itself. Which brings us back to the image we started with. Look at the king holding the nugget, and now you can see what the picture is doing. It's showing you the wrong thing. The nugget was never the wealth. It was the thing the king couldn't spend. The real wealth was the system around the gold, the taxes on the passing caravans, the profit on the state's own trading, the value of the standardized dust, the salt coming south, the markets, the whole machinery of passage. None of that shows up in the painting. The painting shows you the pile, because the pile is what a king looks like to the outside world. But the pile was the part of the system that couldn't be touched. That's the first thing nobody tells you when you picture this empire. The thing you see is the thing that didn't matter. The thing that mattered was invisible. And an empire built on something invisible has to work much harder to keep it. Because holding the corridor was not free. Nothing in this story was free. And the costs are the part most people skip. The route had to be guarded. A road you can't travel safely is a road that produces nothing. Armies had to keep the caravans safe from raiders, because a single caravan lost was a caravan that didn't pay, and a route that felt dangerous was a route that got avoided. The chiefs along the way had to be paid. Tribute, gifts, marriages, loyalty bought with gold, renewed every single year. The caravan towns had to be fed. Granaries had to be full. The administrators had to be paid. The court had to be maintained. And on top of all of it, the entire machine rested on one man. The Mansa was the central node. The treaties, the tribute relationships, the monetary standard, the state trading network, all of it depended on one ruler staying capable, generation after generation. It's a table with 4 legs. The desert corridor stays open. The Mediterranean keeps wanting gold. The independent producers keep producing. And the succession keeps producing capable rulers. Knock out any one leg, and the table goes over. And here's the part that makes this story economics instead of a fairy tale. All 4 of those legs were outside the empire's complete control. The empire could influence them, it could not command them, and it was about to find out which one of them mattered most. Now let's watch what actually happened, because this is where the story stops being a diagram and becomes a real place with a real end. For a century, the machine ran. In the 1350s, a traveler named Ibn Battuta walked into Mali and described a court that ran on order, ceremony, and gold. He described a country where security on the roads was taken seriously, where travelers were treated with respect, and where a visitor was fed and sheltered as a matter of law. That was the corridor at its peak, a road so safe and so valuable that the whole region organized itself around it. And the heart of it was Timbuktu, a city that existed for one reason: the trade. It sat at the meeting point of the desert and the river, where the salt caravans ended and the riverboats began. It grew rich on the passage of goods. And it did something unusual for a trading town. It also became a city of scholars, with libraries, manuscripts, and mosques, paid for by the gold that passed through it. That's what a healthy corridor looks like. The wealth doesn't just stay with the king, it spills into the towns that serve the road. And a city that lives by a road is also a city that can die by a road, because in the 1400s, the world around Mali began to change. The Mediterranean still wanted gold, desperately, but it had found a new way to get it. Portuguese ships had been working their way down the west coast of Africa for decades, and in 1482, they built a fort at a place called Elmina, on the coast. And at Elmina, they did something that had never been possible before. They bought gold directly at the shore. No desert crossing, no camel caravans, no border posts, no market towns, no middleman. A ship pulls up to the coast, trades its goods for gold, and sails home. The road that had made Mali rich was no longer the only way. It was no longer even the best way. It was just a very long, very expensive detour. Now here's the detail that matters. The gold never ran out. The deposits at Bambuck and Buer are still there. The producers didn't stop producing. What stopped was the need for the road. And a road nobody needs is a road that stops being maintained. It stops being guarded. It stops being safe. It stops being used. One caravan at a time, one merchant choosing the coast over the desert, the corridor bled out. The fall that followed was not a single dramatic event, it was a slow strangling. The province of Gao had been growing stronger for years, and its rulers, the rising Songhai state, took Timbuktu in 1468. The Mossi raided from the south. Succession fights tore at the empire after Mansa Musa's reign, and through all of it the gold was still in the ground. Mali shrank back toward its homeland, a shadow of the empire that had once made the gold market in Cairo choke. And here's the human part of the tragedy. The people of the empire had done nothing wrong. The machine had simply been bypassed. The merchants of the caravan towns woke up one year to find that the caravans were smaller, then fewer, then gone. The scholars of Timbuktu kept writing in a city whose reason for existing had quietly changed. Nobody burned the empire down. It was starved, slowly, by a road that stopped being needed. Imagine building the only bridge across a river, living well off that bridge for a century, and then watching a highway get built 30 miles away. The bridge doesn't break, the river doesn't dry up, the bridge is still there, still solid, the same bridge it always was. It's just that nobody needs to cross there anymore. So who survived the shift? Not the people who owned the most gold. The people who owned the new route. Songhai briefly inherited the old corridor, the old routes, the old rocks, the old markets, the old wealth, because the position, not the gold, was the prize. But they were running the same fragile machine on the same dying road, and it kept dying under them. The Portuguese, meanwhile, had become the new middlemen. They bought the gold at the coast and carried it to Europe, sitting exactly where Mali used to sit, in the middle of the flow. Same gold, new road. The lesson of who survived is the same in both cases. The wealth follows the route, not the resource. The empire that controlled the route controlled the gold. And the day someone else controlled a better route, the empire that owned the goldfields had nothing left to sell. The gold was still there. It had always been there. It just didn't belong to the empire anymore, because the empire had never really owned it. It had only owned the way to it. So here is the answer to the question we opened with. How did Mali control the gold trade and build an empire out of it? Not by owning the gold. By owning the only way to move it. By controlling the road the gold had to travel, the market where it changed hands, and the measure used to count it. And above all, by providing the one thing a stranger needs before he'll hand over his gold. Trust. Mali was never really in the gold business. It was in the tollbooth business. The gold flowed through it the way water flows through a mill. The mill doesn't own the water, it owns the wheel. And the day the river changed course, the wheel stopped turning. The gold stayed in the ground, and the empire went with the road. So the next time you see that map from 1375, the king, the nugget, the label calling him the richest and most noble king in all the land, look a little longer. Because the picture is telling you the truth in reverse. The thing that made Mali the richest empire of its age was never in the king's hand. It was the road to his door, and that's what it means to control a trade. Not the thing, the road the thing has to travel.